Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed, the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today I've got another Hare Krishna on. His name is Shivanand Sharma, and we're going to be talking about epistemology. So Shivananda, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
First, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I guess I grew up in the Hare Krishna movement. I work as an actuary in the UK. I'm studying. I'm doing a PhD in philosophy at the University of Birmingham.
How do you do a PhD while working?
Not very well. It's a lot more demanding than I had thought, but I do love it. But yeah, it's not easy, and I'm a little bit behind on where I should be at this point in the PhD.
I've dreamed about doing a philosophy PhD, but having small children and working full time, and especially now that I run my own business, I just don't see it happening unless my wife can start working more and me work less. But yeah, I don't see it happening anytime soon.
I've been in a similar situation, although I suppose it helps a bit that I'm doing mine part-time and it's all mostly done online. Very rarely do I actually need to go in person to the university, so that's made it easier for me.
Right, so on the topic of epistemology, lots of people know what that means, but some people may think this sounds like some boring technical philosophy thing, so maybe we should first explain what questions epistemology answers, which I guess would be things like, does religious experience count as evidence for a religious worldview, or how can we know that there's a real world outside our mind? How can we know other minds exist, and how can we come to more accurate understandings of the world?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. I suppose at its most basic level, epistemology is kind of about understanding what knowledge is and understanding how to attain knowledge. So that's kind of like the very basic project of epistemology. And then from that, you start exploring these more exciting questions like, do religious beliefs count as knowledge? Are they justified? And so forth. But it all starts from that rock bottom level of what is knowledge and how do you know when you have it?
So should we focus on epistemology in a broader sense of solving the hard problem of solving the brain in the vat problem, having a solution to global skepticism? How can we know anything? Or we could focus on, why do Hare Krishnas believe what they believe?
But I guess I suppose those two questions are very closely linked. I mean, the way I've approached it in the past, and what I've been learning about epistemology, is that you start from this basic idea of what is knowledge to begin with, because in order to understand whether our beliefs do count as knowledge, or whether we're warranted in holding them, whether it's rational and so forth, it's good to have an idea of what it is we mean by knowledge and beliefs and so forth in the first place, because with that background to hand, it's easier to get a handle on the question of whether religious beliefs or beliefs in the external world and so forth are rational. And as I understand it, and this is a long tradition, especially in the West as well, knowledge is something traditionally we consider to be justified, true beliefs. That's what most people are familiar with when they come to the term, what they understand by knowledge, but justified, true belief. And it's easy to see why that analysis is there. You can't really know something if you don't believe it. So it stands to reason that knowledge is some sort of a belief. If you don't believe something, then you can't really know it. But it can't just be any belief, because of course we hold many beliefs that aren't true. So you can't have knowledge unless your belief is true. It's a veridical belief, as they would say in philosophy. It's a true belief. But even holding true beliefs, we might think that's not enough, because we can hold true beliefs in a way that makes us doubt whether we might hesitate to say that we have knowledge, even if the belief that we have is true. For example, I might believe something about you, that you're an electrician, and that's a true belief. But I might believe it on the grounds that, I think some fairy came and told it to me. And even though it coincides with the truth, the reason that I hold that belief seems suspect, and I would hesitate to call that knowledge in that case. So that's where we get this idea that knowledge is a justified true belief. It's a belief that's true and arrived at in an appropriate way, in some sort of reliable, dependable way. Now, the question that comes from there, since the name of the game is justification, is can we justify the kind of beliefs that are of particular interest to us? For example, our religious beliefs. Can we really consider those kinds of things justified? What's the criteria for justification? And that's the question.
I feel like we should talk about Gettier problems since we're talking about justified true belief. The Gettier problems are one of the few examples in philosophy where someone came up with something which turned an entire discipline around. Like, for example, you look at a clock and it tells you the time is 8 o'clock, and the time is in fact 8 o'clock. That's both a justified belief and a true belief. However, if later you find out that the batteries have been removed from the clock, and it's been sitting on 8 o'clock for the past 8 weeks, your belief may have been true, but it's no longer justified. But at the time, if you look, or in everyday life, if you look at a clock and you believe what it says, that's justified. However, in this case, then some philosophers now come with this new term, believing something because it's true. So, although you could say you're justified in trusting a clock, if the clock is in fact broken, it's not telling you the correct time because that's the correct time. It's just a coincidence.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a really famous paper, actually. It's a very short paper that was written about this, and it did cause a bit of a revolution in the field. And it's making a really good point, as you really nicely described, Arjuna. I can't add anything to that. But what it makes me appreciate, I suppose, when I reflect on that problem, that we might have justified true beliefs and still not have knowledge, simply because we got lucky with our justification. It's a reliable process of justification, and yet it was faulty, as you described with that clock example. What that makes me appreciate is that our knowledge, in many cases, is fallible. Our processes for arriving at knowledge can be fallible, and that's why it's something I quite like about the epistemology of the Vaishnava tradition, is that it doesn't just rely on one avenue for knowledge. There are a multiplicity of sources of knowledge that tend to, we test our beliefs against more than one source. We look for coherentism amongst our beliefs. We adjudicate them. So we have a background system for assessing the validity of beliefs that seem quite plausible to us based on how we formed those beliefs, but we don't say they're absolutely true. What we tend to do in many cases is check that they cohere with other sources of beliefs, and when they're consistent, that gives us more confidence that we have knowledge. So in the case of that clock, we had one process that relied on perceptual experience of the clock, but we might receive testimony, which is another source of belief, from a friend who told us, well, no, it's a different time. And therefore we have two inconsistent pieces of information, two inconsistent beliefs. If we think our friend is dependable and trustworthy, we also think that clock was dependable and trustworthy, it gives us reason to investigate further, and that investigation might then lead us to the truth. So I think it's really handy, and it's something that we have in our tradition, to have more than one source of belief, corroborating sources that we can use to ward against falsehood or mistakes.
Right. I guess that with the clock example, it might be something like you check the clock, you've also got another clock, which is atomic, which you check, and you check your sundial. And if all three of them say the same time, then your confidence is high. And if the clock on the wall is wrong, you're probably not that worried, because you know clocks on the wall have batteries and they can go flat. But if your sundial and your atomic clock give the correct time, you'll be confident still.
That's right. But also we can check different types of belief forming. We can employ different kinds of belief forming processes or faculties. So in the example you just gave, we had a clock, and we had a watch, and we had other dials that we looked at, and they were all employing a kind of perceptual faculty. We're seeing the time on some device one way or the other. They're all kind of the same process. Whereas we would get even more confidence if not only were we corroborating with other clocks, but we were also corroborating with other types of evidence. So instead of perceptual, we can also look to get, as I mentioned, testimonial evidence. So what do other people say the time is? What do they think the time is? Or something of the kind. So other types of questions, other kinds of evidence might be applicable. Things like memory. We might remember that the events that we just, the things that we just did were meant to happen at a certain time, which doesn't seem to corroborate the time on that clock. So memory is employed as a completely different avenue. It's not perceptual, it's not testimonial, it's something else that comes in. And using these different sources of knowledge or belief forming processes, we can get even stronger confidence that we have some knowledge with us, we have the truth.
So what about global skepticism? Like, if you want to talk about testimony from other people or other forms of corroborating evidence, I might imagine there's an alternative explanation that someone could imagine, which is that all of these are merely figments of my imagination. That the people that are saying they've had the same experience as I've had, they're all seeing a glowing ball in the sky, and I can't count that as proof that the sun exists unless I've first proven that these other people exist. If they're just another figment of the illusion I'm experiencing, then I don't have testimony of other people. I just have other features of my imagination or of the illusion I'm experiencing.
Yeah, that's right. This skepticism argument, worry, has been around a long time, and much of epistemology, as I understand it, has been geared towards, blocking the destructive effects of that kind of skepticism.
Did it come up in Indian debates, in Indian traditions, or did they not go there?
I have to say, I'm not fully attuned or familiar. I'm not an expert in the epistemological tradition in India, but from what I understand, I think they did go there, because in Indian philosophy, there's a very close relationship. It's a bit different in the West, but in the Indian tradition, there's a very close relationship with your epistemology and your metaphysical worldviews. One motivates the other, whereas these disciplines are often isolated in the Western traditions. Not always, but often. So in the Indian traditions, because some of the philosophies, the metaphysical positions that were proposed as the ultimate truth were non-realist, because they, you know, they, so there's two different types of metaphysical positions in general. You can have realist tradition, a realist outlook, where you think there is an external world, for example, and you are engaging with it. Or you can have a non-realist kind of outlook where you think that's not really there. That's just an illusion of some sort. And there are even some traditions that might say, well, there's nothing there. The ultimate reality is some sort of emptiness. So because of that metaphysical idea that was at the heart of some traditions in the Indian Indian tradition or schools, they developed epistemologies that was consistent with that outlook. So I would imagine that there were quite a lot of debates about the skeptical position about, as you mentioned, whether there is an external world. How can we even have confidence that what we're seeing and what we think we're experiencing is real? If anything, it's probably more discussed in the Indian tradition.
That's an interesting point. That's got me thinking. One of the things I like to do with an epistemology is test it to see whether an epistemology that someone puts forward is capable of establishing as true things which the person believes who holds that epistemology. So if you hold to a particular epistemology on which I cannot prove to you that I exist, but you also believe that I exist, that's a mismatch. And so one of the things, the common thing that philosophers will say epistemology is it's how we figure out when we've got knowledge or what knowledge is. But I think we can look at it the reverse way and say, we know these things are true, but how do we know these things? So if an epistemology, I feel like an epistemology should be able to explain how everyday people come to knowledge of real external world realism and the existence of other minds, because all over the world people believe in the reality of the external world and the existence of other minds, yet philosophers by and large push epistemologies which say we can't know these things. The point I'm coming to that relates to what you said about the difference with the Indian traditions is you wouldn't find this mismatch if a tradition in India put forward a worldview or put forward an epistemology which had entailments like non-realism, then they would also buy into that with their epistemology, that they would be consistent across the board.
By and large, I would say so, yes. There's a really nice way you describe it, actually. And in the West, we have it as well. We have this concern about consistency. But I think it was particularly, in my view, it was particularly prominent in the Eastern traditions, because, like in Indian philosophy, the word that they use for sort of a world view or a particular philosophical position was darshana. So you've got these 6 darshanas of what's called Hindu philosophy nowadays. Things like Sankhya, Vaisheshika, I think, Yoga, Purvamimamsa, and so forth. These are all different darshanas. It's kind of like a worldview, a vision, an outlook on reality, and each darshana came with its metaphysical position, its corroborating epistemology, and its vision of what the meaning or purpose of life was. What's the ultimate goal? And they were all competing, vying for the hearts and souls of the public to buy into this particular darshana. In the West, then perhaps it was something like that historically, but not so much nowadays. Now it's more fragmented, I think, in the West. Epistemology is a case in point. That you might have a certain epistemology outlook on how you come to arrive at knowledge, but it might not be wedded to a particular metaphysical worldview so much.
Yeah, well, I mean, one difference maybe in Indian traditions, anything would go in one sense. There was a lot more diversity of what people were prepared to believe, whereas in the West, there's kind of stock standard beliefs that anyone who's anyone believes these things about the world. But then there'll be differences on epistemology. So you have a variety of opinions on epistemology, but not so much tolerance for differences on metaphysics. Because if you disagree on metaphysics, then you don't embrace the kind of scientific skepticism that's built the Western world and is so revered and respected.
Yeah, that's I guess that's the legacy of the Enlightenment. And it never used to be like that. This is especially prominent in epistemology. This evidential requirement and how it links in, how that ties in with our views about what counts as evidence, what counts as science. That kind of vision, or that kind of worldview that was propagated since the time of the Enlightenment and the whole scientific revolution was something really, it changed the direction of Western philosophy, Western society. It really, the world we live in now is actually quite young. It's in a sense, the kind of views that we have only been developing for a few hundred years. And we see it quite strongly in epistemology. Since the Enlightenment, the idea, for example, of religious beliefs, the idea that there was a kind of a maxim that, you should only believe that for which you have good evidence. You have an epistemic duty to only believe that which you have good evidence for. And it was somehow epistemically irresponsible to believe something that you didn't have good evidence for. And that idea of evidence was wedded to a kind of an epistemological outlook that today we would call classical foundationalism, which is it's a way of understanding how our knowledge gets structured, that we have certain rock bottom foundational beliefs, and the only things that get included within that rock bottom foundational beliefs the very limited kinds of beliefs that get included within that privileged group of beliefs, and all the other beliefs that we have are built on that foundation. We kind of infer from our rock bottom basic beliefs up to all the other beliefs that we have. And the worry is we can't justify religious beliefs on those grounds, because the foundation of our beliefs don't seem to admit basic religious beliefs. And if they don't admit basic religious beliefs, and it seems also difficult to derive those religious beliefs from those basic beliefs, then it seems like we don't have evidence or adequate evidence for our religious beliefs, and then they get criticized as being irrational. I think you've hit on a really crucial concern, but there's quite good arguments that have been developed, in the recent decades to demonstrate that religious beliefs are rational, which I personally find quite persuasive.
The trouble I have with that kind of skepticism, like we could call it the skeptical maxim, believe only that which you have good evidence for. First of all, where's the good evidence that you should only believe things which you have good evidence for? And second of all, where's your good evidence for your good evidence, or your good evidence for your good evidence for your good evidence? It's a kind of epistemology which only works if you shine it as a light, not on itself. So if you say these are the things we believe, these are our rock bottom beliefs, and then you don't apply your epistemology to establishing the truth of those beliefs, then it's fine. And that's my observation of people who, like atheists, skeptics, naturalists, who push those kind of epistemologies. They'll say, where's the evidence for God's existence? Where's the evidence for the spiritual reality? And on and on. And if you say to them, well, where's your evidence for the existence of other minds or external world realism, they'll say, and the classic thing, well, I think there was one philosopher who went out and kicked a rock and said, here's the evidence, I can kick it. Here's the evidence of the external world. But really what it boils down to is you have certain things which the quality of your experience of makes you convinced that they're real, and then you use those as evidence for other things. So, well, also testimony in religious context is widely rejected as evidence by skeptics, but the testimony is used, it's basically what scientific epistemology is completely built out of. There's not a single scientist who's done every experiment for themselves. Basically what scientists do is study a tiny corner of one tiny field, and then for everything else they trust the testimony of other scientists. Yeah.
Well, you raise some really important points. Let me see if I can pick out a few of them, because it's really valuable points to dwell on. For one thing, I think, especially in our tradition, what I try to do is really understand where some of these concerns come from, because often there's quite good points that's being raised, and it helps us, especially within our tradition, to really assess the rationality of our own beliefs when we have to respond to certain challenges. So, for example, you talked about that self-defeating kind of argument that or principle that evidentialists might have. I find that quite persuasive. Alvin Plantinga is a Christian philosopher. He raised the same critique of the foundationalist world kind of epistemology we talked about before, where he said quite the same thing. Because in classical foundationalism, the idea is to build your knowledge on a foundation of certitudes, which sounds quite good. Like if you want knowledge, then you had better be certain about the things that you're believing. Either you know them for certainty directly, or you're inferring from your certain knowledge. You're inferring things, probably using some sort of deductive process or even inductive process. You infer to your other beliefs, and that gives you confidence. And that kind of ambition is quite respectable. But as you say, it falls prey to its own requirements, and it's something that isn't held. The standards that we tend to hold religious beliefs to are far beyond the standards, as you nicely pointed out, that we hold some of our other rational beliefs to, like the existence of other minds, or the belief in the past, or belief in the future, or a belief that the sun will rise tomorrow. None of these things fit the foundationalist standards. They don't meet the foundationalist standards for knowledge.
Yeah, like just because the sun rose the last 300 days, or the last 10,000 days in a row, doesn't mean it'll rise tomorrow. The chicken got fed 300 days in a row by the farmer, but tomorrow the chicken's going to be dinner.
Yeah, Hume was the first one who kind of really he raised this whole, it's called the problem of induction, as I understand it, and it's based on this idea. The reason it's a worry in epistemology is because it's based on a commitment to the past being like the future, or my experiences being similar to what other objects that I see in the world must have. And those things are all assumptions. We don't actually have objective evidence for any of those things, or verifiable evidence for any of those things. And yet we take them to be reasonable. We take it reasonable to believe that the sun is going to rise, that there's other people in the world besides me, that I wasn't just born five minutes ago with, kitted out with all my memories and so forth. We take those things as reasonable. So if those things are reasonable, it's hard to see why the same methodology, the same approach can't be applied to religious beliefs. Now, you mentioned a really good point earlier when you spoke. You talked about the quality of our experience, and I suppose if we were being, if we consider what someone who was opposed to religious beliefs might say, or was even just kind of neutral about it, agnostic, they might doubt whether our religious experiences really are of, some sort of special quality that we can't deny it. Because illusions are often of that kind of quality. We tend to believe, we might have an illusion that in principle we can't distinguish from reality. So then, in what sense they might charge, what sense are religious beliefs any different? But of course, as you nicely pointed out, that same concern could be raised against the other things that we hold to be rational, the existence of other people and so forth.
All right, so I was just thinking about the resolution of the stream. Do you have any more points to make?
Well, yeah. One thing I can say is about this idea of the rationality of religious beliefs, whether we need to wed it to this foundational picture, foundationalism, because as you pointed out, foundationalism doesn't stand on sturdy ground. We can't even justify our belief in foundationalism using the principles of foundationalism. So that seems on shaky ground by itself. And the way some philosophers recently have supported the rationality of religious beliefs is by abandoning, in some way, the foundationalist picture of knowledge. We often hear of this as a kind of a distinction between, the internalist, externalist debate in epistemology. The idea that on one side you have, like the foundationalists, you have your beliefs being justified internally. Either I have rock bottom basic beliefs from my senses, or if something is self-evident, and by self-evident we just mean if you understand it, then no one can deny that it's true. Like, for example, you can't have an object that's red all over and yellow all over at the same time. That's a self-evident kind of proposition. So foundationalism based on those principles might not be itself justifiable, because we can't, foundationalism itself isn't self-evident, or foundationalism itself can't be proven from our sense experience. So by its own lights, foundationalism fails. And the alternative picture is to appeal to a kind of externalism about knowledge. I think the Indian epistemological tradition is much more in line with this view, based on how I understand it. I don't think the Indian epistemological traditions would generally go for the foundationalist picture that we have in the West. I think they're more on the externalist kind of picture of knowledge. And the difference there is that we take our basic beliefs to be justified in virtue of being formed from some sort of reliable cognitive process or faculty. So, for example, you're justified in in believing things that you see of the outside world, that you're justified in believing that there is an external world, because you tend to think that the cognitive process or faculty that you have, your vision, perception, is reliable, and it's externally justified. It's not all within your mind that the justification comes. It's externally certified, you could say, by being a reliable process. So things like perception or testimony or reasoning, these, when conducted or applied in a reliable, trustworthy way, where we could see, for example, that there's, fruits, the fruits of our beliefs have practical beneficial effects in the world and so forth, then that process in itself lends certification to the truth of those beliefs. And that's how we have justified knowledge. It's not necessary that we have a rock bottom belief just from, say, sense perception or self-evident statements, and we build up knowledge from there. It's more that we have certain cognitive faculties, either it's perception or it's a reasoning faculty, that allows us to get certain beliefs, and from there we can form other beliefs. And that is itself justified. Of course, that's open to you have to have a system in place to check it against other faculties, to make sure that one faculty might be deficient in a particular circumstance, so it might need validation or correction from another epistemological source. But that's the same for foundationalism anyway, and it's the same for any other practice that we have in forming beliefs. So I think the Indian philosophical system would probably align more with what's nowadays called the externalist view, or what might be called reliabilism in epistemology, relying on a particular cognitive process to form beliefs.
Right. I've got a few things to say on that. So first one is, you mentioned that foundationalism can't justify itself, and I think an assumption you were holding, which I disagree with, that led you to that belief, is that foundationalism relies on data, whereas in epistemology I like to think of two categories of sense making. One is data, information, experience, stuff that comes to us that we experience, and another is logic, reason, argument, concepts. Perhaps there's more categories, but I find these two categories suffice. And if we say that in both of these categories something can be self-evident, then foundationalism can justify itself. So the skeptical maxim, disbelieve everything unless you've got good evidence for it, that would lead to global skepticism if applied consistently. But it also cannot justify itself, because global skepticism means you're also skeptical of the thing that tells you which you should be skeptical. So if you apply, if the skeptic were skeptical of his skepticism, then he would realize this problem. Whereas this idea that a logical concept could be self-evident means it could be self-evident that you should only believe things which you have good evidence for, because that's a logical idea, and it could just be this concept is self-evidently true to me. So it could be, I could have a self-evident apprehension of the fact that I have reliable epistemic faculties, or at least somewhat reliable, and I can get closer to truth by exercising them. And that could justify a kind of foundationalism.
Let me ask you a bit more about it. It's a really interesting way you describe it there. So first of all, you talked about self-evident. My reading, and it might be that I'm applying the wrong understanding to self-evident for what you intend. Normally, so let me put it this way. In classical foundationalism, the rock bottom basic beliefs are normally categorized into three types: self-evident beliefs, or things that come from your senses, from your five senses, or incorrigible beliefs. Now, self-evident beliefs are not something that's self-evident just to you or me or a particular person. It's not about the person. It's objectively self-evident based on the thing that it is. So, for example, the statement, all bachelors are unmarried, is a self-evident statement, because once you understand the meaning of that thing, then you see it to be true. Or the statement, you can't have something red all over white. But the point is, that's one part of your foundation that they admit. The other part is sense evidence, which you talked about, and then the other part is incorrigible beliefs. So that's things that you can't be wrong about. For example, you might be wrong that you're seeing, something green out there, that there might be a green object in your environment. You might be wrong because it might be an illusion, but you can't be wrong about the fact that you think you're seeing something green. So those three things, those three types of belief, are included within the classical foundationalist picture. And is that the one that is that the view that you think is okay?
Trying to think. I mean, incorrigible, it sounds like that just describes qualia. Basically, if you're gonna be skeptical and talk about incorrigible beliefs, all you would have is qualia. So I can say I'm being appeared to treely, but I can't say a tree exists. The existence of the tree is a theory, and that's something I could be wrong about, but I can't be wrong that I'm being appeared to treely. So that would, I guess, that's what we would mean by incorrigible. So that's perhaps not what I mean by self-evident. But back on when you talked about self-evident, you gave a standard definition, which is something which you understand to be true, which you realize the truth of simply by understanding what the sentence means. But there's still...
Is that how you understand it as well?
Yeah, I can work. Yeah, that definition works. But the trouble there is, you were saying it's subjective. It's not about what anybody thinks or believes. It's not about the state of the epistemic agent. But then you went on to describe the state of the epistemic agent as having understood the concept. So basically, there's nothing in epistemology other than qualia, perhaps. Someone could lack, like an animal can have incorrigible beliefs about the qualia it's experiencing. So that's available to everyone. But other than that, theories about the world, there could be any number of them which are self-evident once you understand them. But how many people understand them? It's still the state of the epistemic agent which determines whether they are in an understanding relationship to the self-evident truth. So, like, an example in philosophy is two people solve a math problem. Both of them think they're pretty good at math, and both of them think they got the correct answer. And then they cross-reference and find they each came to different answers. Now they both think, well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe the other one's wrong. One of us has to be wrong. And they check. One of them might look through the other ones and be like, oh, you made a mistake here. And previously that person thought I'd gotten to the correct answer, and now he understands why his answer was wrong. And it's simply by putting the epistemic agent in touch with more data. So, like when you talk about something being self-evident, a concept and so on, people will say that makes justified belief too cheap, because anyone could just say, well, I feel like it's true that the moon's made out of cheese, because it's for phenomenal conservatism. You're justified in believing things which seem to be true to you in the absence of a defeater. But not all epistemic agents are equal. So maybe that person has a justified belief in the sense of they are acting rationally and holding that belief because their intuitions about the world tell them that's the way the world is. But another person who's better educated, has more data, has a more expanded mind, will have different intuitions about the world, and those are more reliable. And that other person who believes the moon's made out of cheese, they could go to university, get an education, and someone could put their mind in contact with the relevant sense data to the point where it becomes self-evident to them that the moon is in fact not made out of cheese.
So you're saying, so am I understanding correctly? The idea here is that self-evident things are things that may not be evident to everyone. Is that the idea?
Once
because
you
they're not
understand
in the right
them.
epistemic frame?
Once you understand them. I mean, everyone's had the experience of either thinking about the world or some concept or something in a particular way, and then having someone explain it to you, and then now you think about it in a completely different way. Or sometimes we're on the other end of that and we explain something to someone else. And that's an example of something that was previously not self-evident becoming self-evident, because now this thing's been explained to us. It's like, oh, of course, how could I have not have seen that sooner? Or, yeah, I was totally mistaken before. And it could be any number of things that we do that with, and that's just because our epistemic faculties, our mind, comes in contact with the relevant concepts in order for us to be able to appreciate the self-evident truth.
I agree with you on that. But the question, I suppose, that the challenge that people would raise is that religious beliefs aren't those kinds of beliefs. They're not conceptual in that sense, or at least religious experiences aren't. So it's not like everybody, if once you explain it to them enough, I think the worry is no matter how much you explain a religious experience or belief, there will be people who simply don't get it. And it's not because they're in the right they're in the wrong conceptual alignment. It's that they haven't had the experience. So are you taking self-evident to be conceptual then? So long as someone may not understand it, but when they are brought to understand what the terms mean, what the concepts are, then they see it to be true. If that's what you mean, then definitely I think that's the foundationalist picture. And I think that's reasonable to hold. The question comes when we move from there to religious foundations. People would challenge whether that is self-evident. I don't think, for example, an atheist may fully understand the concepts that we're using in religious discourse. They may really get it, and yet they may disbelieve it. And so it's not self-evident in that sense. Because I like the way you described it. Self-evident is in principle accessible to everyone. I think that's the point. To be self-evident is in principle. If you understand the concepts and you understand the meanings of the terms, you will get it. You just have to be, at least you might have to be taught what the terms mean. But religious experiences aren't really like that, are they?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of being qualified to understand the truth of something is widely accepted in science. I mean, there's perhaps too much gatekeeping in science of, well, you can't have an opinion on this unless you have a PhD in the subject. Here's what the PhDs think. Yeah. And of course, there's problems with that. Like the main one I could give here is that a large amount of the innovation that in a given field comes from people working from another field. Or often people who do the most amazing discoveries are not trained in the field in which they do those discoveries. So there's too much gatekeeping. But still, there's this idea that when scientists prove something, they're not required to prove it to every John, Dick, and Harry. They prove it to other scientists. And anyone is in principle capable of going to university and understanding the science and appreciating the proof for themselves. Or maybe they could push back on it and show these scientists, show that actually what was previously thought to be proven is actually false. That's all. People are open to that kind of thing, at least in principle, maybe not in practice. There's a lot of inertia in scientific paradigms. But when it comes to religious epistemology, I'm a big fan of the way Graham Oppy, the attitude he brings to these sorts of things, because he'll say, I've never met a theist that I've discussed these subjects with who I consider to be irrational in their beliefs. We come to different opinions, and there's people on both sides of the debate who've studied these arguments till they're black and blue, and it's very rare that someone will be swayed. In saying that, though, I have noticed a pattern and conversion stories that I've heard. I mean, there's a pattern in the skeptic stories. The skeptic who's like, I tried, I looked into it, I studied the arguments, I gave God the opportunity to convince me, and I'm not convinced. There's a pattern to those stories, but there's another pattern to the stories of the people who were skeptical and converted, and it's perhaps explained better by starting with the people who convert, which is people that are, someone in a battle thinking, God, if you get me out of here alive, I'll dedicate my life to you. And the person survives the war thinking they were going to die, and then a series of coincidences occur that bring them into a religious culture, and they become a theist. There was you may know this story, especially if you're in the UK. There was a devotee. He later became a devotee, and he thought God doesn't exist, but I'm going to rob a bank, and if I survive, then God must exist. And he went in there, robbed the bank. The lady had a heart attack, didn't push the duress button, and he's standing there with the money. Nobody's noticed anything. He walks out, and then like a week later, he meets a Hare Krishna on the street and becomes a Hare Krishna. He was convinced from that situation. Because so the pattern I'm pointing out here is this person who converts. They'll make a pact with God. If you do this, I will do this. If you get me out of here, if you give me this kind of evidence, then I'm yours. I'll dedicate my life to you. And the skeptic who remains a skeptic, I mean, obviously I don't want to psychoanalyze, and I could be wrong about whether or not I'm accurate in this, but this just seems to be the case to me, that the skeptic is more likely to say, I've looked at the arguments, I've studied them, none of them convinced me, I tried to be convinced and I wasn't convinced, but there's not this, if you do this, then I'll do this. It's not a reciprocal thing. And my guess is that God responds to that kind of, I will commit if you do this, whereas I don't see these skeptics saying, if you give me this kind of evidence, I'm going to dedicate my life to you. Do you have any comments on that? I mean, I don't know if this is off topic or not.
No, it's interestingly, it's all stuff that is discussed in the literature. I mean, there's a whole literature on this specific issue of what counts as a religious experience, and do they have evidential value. So my personal inclination is that some of these kinds of my view is that some of this kind of I don't know how to describe the cases that you just gave, like someone robbed the bank, for example. They made a pact with God, and they felt that God intervened in some way in their life. That may be the case, and it may not be the case. It could be any number of reasons why that event happened, and someone may just be psychologically inclined to infer that it was God, but it could have been something else. It could have been the devil, for all we know.
Well, I mean,
if you believe in the devil.
To apply a bit of statistical reasoning, we should be fair and say we don't hear about all the people that robbed a bank after making that kind of pact with God and didn't later become a theist. We don't hear about all the people in the battlefield who said, if you get me out of here, I'm going to dedicate my life to you, and either didn't get out of the battle alive or got out of the battle alive and never became a theist. We only hear about the cases where they did become a theist, right? So there could be a filtered sample where all of the interesting stories rise to the top, but and it seems statistically like, wow, these series of coincidences, or this one coincidence, could not have been by chance, especially given the specificity of what the person said to God and then what later came into their life. But it could just be that there's billions of people who've done the same thing through history, and statistically it's bound to happen by chance.
Yeah, but the question is whether that's a rational belief to hold. That's the whole debate in the religious epistemology. You might have some sort of experience, or you might have a belief, like that person believed that it was God, for example, but is that a rational belief to hold? Given alternative explanations or alternative hypotheses, what weighs one way or the other? That's why I'm more inclined to the philosophical kind of strategies for justifying religious beliefs. And let me give two kind of elaborations on what I mean. So you talked about foundationalism, and there is a way to understand foundationalism that I think is quite defensible in the religious context. And the idea is the foundational beliefs don't just include sense experience or self-evident truths. They also contain, just as you have experiences coming through your five senses, and you've kitted out with faculties to receive that information, you might be kitted out with faculties to receive divine input. You might be able to have religious experiences, and they are relevantly analogous to sense experience. So there's a philosophical literature which goes into a debate on religious experiences. Now, what those persons experience, they made some sort of pact and so forth. It may be a religious experience, but it may not. One of the distinguishing characteristics of mystical experiences is that you align yourself, or you, like the word you used before, you qualify yourself through a certain rigorous process for a communion with God in some way. And there's a lot of evidence that kind of reports of mystical experience seem defensible, because there's quite a, throughout the history of different traditions, there's corroborating reports of the same kinds of mystical experience, which count as evidence. But these experiences are then corroborated with different parts of your epistemology to give it weight. So not anything counts as a religious experience. Like one famous point that's made is that someone may have a religious feeling. You may feel a certain elation, bliss or something, but that's not a religious experience, no more than normal feelings are the same as experiences. You might have feelings associated with experiences or as a kind of experience, but it's not necessarily a religious experience. So for example, say you feel happy when you're in the presence of someone. That's not the same thing as saying you're experiencing that person. Later you may come to believe that you were happy because that person was there, but because you had that feeling of happiness, that's not identical to saying you experienced that person. At the time you may not even be aware that the person was there. And in the same way, we may have happy feelings in a religious practice, but that's not necessarily a religious experience. It could be associated with a religious experience, but normally, when you talk about a religious experience, you're talking about contact with something divine, direct contact. And mystical processes are traditionally defined as processes that put you in a cognitive alignment so that you can have reliable, predictable kinds of religious experiences or contact. I think Krishna consciousness is quite like that. We have meditative practices. We have a process of bhakti that brings us into alignment. It qualifies us, in your words, which I thought was brilliant. It qualifies us to have access to something. That doesn't make it self-evident, because self-evident is something conceptual. This is a pure experience, which is, you have direct access or contact with something. No matter how much you explain that to someone else, even if they're fitted out with all the cognitive tools and concepts, it doesn't mean they will have that same experience. But you can put yourself through a process, a rigorous process, and that's what mysticism is all about, and in the literature, that puts you in alignment with that divine reality, and then you have an experience. And then, because it's a systematic process, and because it's very philosophically grounded and checked against other epistemological tools, you can have more confidence that, okay, this seems I think I can put some credence on this belief that is formed by this process. Now, I don't want to discount the kind of experiences that you talked about earlier, But I'm more inclined, that's what I'm trying to say. I'm more inclined to an epistemological approach that is systematic and reliable. And as I guess you could say, in a sense, that's quite close to the approach we adopt with sense experience, because other people can go and conduct the experiment and get the same reports or results. And that, that intersubjectivity, that corroboration and cross-checking is something very important for an epistemic process to give it credibility. And I think mystical processes like Krishna consciousness, I'm using that term in the sense that's used in literature, a systematic process for contact with the divine. I think it's a similar idea. It's something that could be cross-checked, something that other people can in principle practice and get the same experience, and therefore corroborate what you're experiencing, and thereby give you confidence that the beliefs you're deriving from that process are reliable.
So first on the self-evident point, perhaps I'm not using the term the way it's used in the literature. I use it like a catch-all phrase for, like a belief, something that proves itself. So, like, my experience of the sun, it proves the existence of the sun. My understanding of the concept of math proves that 1 + 1 = 2.
So I would say that idea is, it's not foundationalism as it's understood in the literature. It's what I think is the better process. It's the better approach. It's externalism. So the idea is
it phenomenal conservatism?
Can you explain to me what you mean by phenomenal conservatism?
It's a recent thing that's been written about recently, but a few philosophers are putting it forward. It's kind of like, what's Plantinga's one called again?
Plantinga is reformed epistemology.
Yeah.
So it's he rejected foundationalism and he went for a form of externalism, which is what I think is quite reliable.
So it's kind of like Plantinga's thing. Instead of saying, Plantinga said we have a sensus divinatus, we have externalism. If it's true that we have an ability to sense God's existence built into us, then we're justified in trusting our sense of God's existence. So it's a justified belief. He just makes this case that it's just a theist can be justified in their belief in theism in the absence of evidence. And it's an externalist worldview because it's only a justified belief if their belief is in fact true. Phenomenal conservatism.
And that's incidentally, that's why it's kind of considered externalism, because it's externally certified. It's not all entirely up to you and your internal beliefs. It's something that you've fitted out. You have a cognitive faculty to pick up that data.
A phenomenal conservatism in a nutshell just says you're justified in believing things which seem to be true in the absence of defeaters.
But wouldn't that apply to, that applies to all views, isn't it? How is that not foundationalist then?
I would say these fit in the foundational camp. As for the debate of externalism versus internalism, I think it's a debate over semantics rather than a philosophical debate. They're just arguing that this is what we should use the word knowledge to refer to, but I think they're debating different things. If we just gave them each their own word, then it would clarify the fact that it's a semantic debate. So the externalist is saying, under these conditions, when acting in this way, an epistemic agent is being rational. That's externalism. So, the epistemic agent has this sense data, is working with these concepts, and they come to these beliefs. They're skeptical in this way, they're trusting in this way, and this is either rational or irrational. Whereas externalism says is an absolute worldview, which nobody has. We don't have an objective agent that has absolute access to an absolute understanding of the state of an epistemic agent to be able to say this person believes this belief because it's true, therefore it's true knowledge. That doesn't exist. So to hold belief to this high standard, which isn't possible because, but yeah, I think it's silly to hold beliefs to that standard, first of all, but second of all, I think that's what it's doing. It's this. So yeah, the internalism, I think, is actually an external thing in the sense that the internalist thinks wants to have an absolute foundation for knowledge, but only God, an external epistemic agent with complete perfect knowledge, would be capable of assessing whether that agent is having on an absolute platform fully accurate understandings of the world. So I just find it a weird standard to hold.
Well, let me tell you what I understand. I'll tell you what I understand by the whole internalist externalist debate thing. I think there's something in it, but I'll tell you why. The internalist externalist debate, as I understand it, is just about where you get your justification for your beliefs. So as we talked about at the beginning, you have knowledge when you have a true belief that's justified in the right kind of way. And the name of the game is how do you spell out that justification? What counts as justification? The internalist is going to say that your justification is internal to you. So when we talked about foundationalism, they said their view is that you have a foundation of certain beliefs, certitudes, things that you're confident are definitely true. For example, what I call self-evident beliefs, what we talked about as incorrigible beliefs. You talked about qualia in that respect. So those things, you can't be wrong of those things. So that's their foundation, which for them, it's self-luminous. They know that that's true. And then they infer the rest of their beliefs on that foundation. But that's all internal to the person. That's all, every aspect of that system is completely internal to the individual. The externalist is saying you don't need to base your whole system of knowledge on an internalist process. You can have an external factor that's giving you the certification of knowledge. So it doesn't need to be grounded on things like sense experience or incorrigible beliefs or self-evident truths. You can be externally justified. Say, for example, if God, this is just an example, if God, gave you a faculty that allows you access to data that's external to you. For example, God gives you sense perception so that you can receive information from the outside world. The externals will say that's an external factor. Number one, it's relying on God being, something that's outside of you, God. It's relying on, your faculties being in working order. And that's not something you can know outright just by reflecting on your own internal workings, because you could be in deep illusion. But the externalists will say, that is actually how we arrive at knowledge. When we see another person, and we think that's really a person existing out of my mind, or we see a tree and we think, okay, that's really something that's out there, that's not internally justified. For them, it's externally justified. It's justified by the fact that we have faculties in working order that's designed perhaps by either evolution or by God. And it doesn't just depend on my internal access to truths and beliefs. It depends on something that I may not have control over. So that's the debate. And there's a lot hinging on it. So the reason Plantinga rejected internalism is because he said most of the things in the world, your skeptical points earlier, most of the beliefs that we have can't be justified internally. Belief in other people, belief in the past, belief in the future, belief in the external world. None of those things can be justified internally. It's relying on an external thing that we have certain faculties in working order that have access to the world, and there's no intervening forces that create room for error and so forth. Those are all external factors beyond our control. But Plantinga says that's a better representation of how we have knowledge. It's not, to hinge our knowledge on the internalist side, internalist approach isn't going to do justice. And the reason there's a lot at stake is because if you subscribe to an externalist picture, then you create room for something like justified beliefs in God, for instance, because that's justified externally. It's not just justified internally. Although you can come up with certain arguments that purport to show through logic alone that God exists, which is an internal kind of justification. But most of the time, you're appealing to external factors that are not internally justified. And Plantinga and other, the Reformed epistemologists in general, that camp, they want to say that externalist is the way to go, because by externalism, you can justify the external world, you can justify your belief that the sun is going to rise, you can say that your religious beliefs are rational as well. All of those things seem more intuitive to them. And personally, I find that picture quite plausible.
So I guess part of it may be that I don't see how internalism is the slightest bit plausible. How does the internalist know that their senses are working reliably?
Yeah, well, that's the argument that you gave earlier against the classical foundationalist view. That's exactly the point. I think that critique that you're giving is the critique that Plantinga gave against foundationalism, which is an internalist view. It's an internalist strategy. And the idea is you can't know that. It's self-refuting. Whereas it's like what you said earlier. It's not a consistent picture. If you buy into a purely internalist picture of knowledge, like foundationalism, then you're going to be refuting yourself. You're going to be undermining your own self with or you're not going to be able to justify the kinds of belief that you think are rational, like the existence of other people or the existence of an external world. So Plantinga urged, and others, many other philosophers, Alston and quite a few others, they urged that this internalist picture isn't the whole story. Of course, there may be some internalist kinds of, domains that we get knowledge from. That's not in doubt, but it's not the whole story. And quite a lot of the beliefs that are really central to the way we live are not justified internally. The internalist picture is a little bit self-defeating in that respect. So I'm with you on that. I think you're right.
I think that there's an interesting difference here between Eastern and Western mindsets. Jonathan Haidt noticed this difference and wrote about it in his book. I think that was called The Moral Landscape. He went and stayed in India with native Indians, and, lived among their culture. I think he might have been in Gujarati. I can't remember exactly where he stayed, and he was amazed by the culture, the women in traditional female roles and the men in traditional male roles. But he observed, even though, from a Western mindset, this might seem like, oh, these women are not getting treated well. They were totally happy. But it was, he used this term, a hive mentality. So there was this sort of identification with a hive, kind of, as opposed to in the West, we have this rampant individualism. And this difference was made really stark for him when, after weeks of staying with his family and being given the most amazing hospitality, as you can imagine, then he gets on the airplane and there's a Westerner there yelling at the stewardess saying, "You tell him that spot's for my luggage." And it's like, it's just a bag. Your bag's just going to go somewhere in the overhead storage, and you're going to get it when you get off. And so I think in epistemology, how I'm tying this in is internalism. I was picturing this difference, the way you were explaining it was giving me some clarity. I was seeing it that internalism is I want to have everything proved to me, and then I'll believe it. And I'm going to personally verify everything. Whereas the Eastern mindset is more of a hive mentality, the classic Hare Krishna example that the hand feeds the stomach. The society working in a cohesive way makes it work, and also for our knowledge making, we could be like that. So, I mean, we do that with science. We say, well, the scientists are doing their job. Isn't it enough to believe the conclusions they come to? That's not, it doesn't sound like an internalist picture. Just, well, the scientists say it's true, so it must be true, right? I mean, you could say, okay, well, we've verified, that I like engineering examples or medical examples. The dentist, you go to the dentist and with a toothache, and every time you leave, your tooth stops aching. Isn't that enough to show that all their theories about biology are true? It's like, well,
Right.
maybe it is, but I still don't see how that's internalism. Like you've built your confidence that these people know what they're doing, but you haven't verified all these beliefs yourself. So again, I'm seeing this mismatch between what people believe and what people practice. So there's actually, this kind of ties into another point. So now we're talking about culture, but I guess this ties into epistemic differences between Eastern and Western traditions. I was hearing someone talk about, I can't remember his name just now, that sannyasi, the Russian one who does lots of nice seminars. So, I'll think of his name in a minute. He was talking about how lots of Russians all over the world become Hare Krishnas, but not just Russians, Russian-speaking people. And actually, there's a variety of cultures who speak Russian, and they have differences. So he says it's something about the language, and then he talks about how language governs how people think. But then he got into this point about how the difference, so basically language determines how you see the world, because if you don't have the language to articulate something, you're incapable of thinking about it, because we think in language. And English, there's very little passive tense, and I'm not sure what that means, but he gave an example which I think tells me what it means. I'm sure you'll know what it means. But the example is if you're writing in lots of things in passive tense in a Word document, the computer will tell you there's something wrong with your writing, and you should make grammatical changes. So an example he gave of passive tense is, instead of saying "I did it," you say "it was done by me." So in the West, there's the way we speak in English. It's all about I did. Everything's I focused. When we construct a sentence, I did this, I did that. I'm the doer. Whereas I guess based on what he's saying, I'm inferring that in the Russian language, there may be more of talking about yourself in a passive sense of you being there along for a ride, or you may be doing things, but you're talking about something that was done by you, not something I did. So yeah, tying that back. Yeah, I think I've made my point about tying that back into epistemology.
You made me think of something. Don't quote me on this, but I think I recall I once attended a Sanskrit class, and I think I recall this point being made. But I wouldn't want anyone to quote me on this. But there are these when you learn the verb tables, I guess. You start with the first person. Normally in the West, we have the first person, second person, third person. When you're learning it in the Sanskrit, tradition, I think you start with the third person, second person, and first person last. That's the order you go. And when you memorize these tables, and I think that point was made, that the culture was, it was definitely around there was a focus on the other, and anyway, I mean, I'm speculating there, but it's a really interesting point you made.
Yeah, we should probably tie this all back in again. We're talking about cultural differences. So yeah, externalism and Eastern traditions. Yeah, I've always identified as a foundationalist, and I still do, because I think that my understanding of the relevant logic and my contact with the relevant experiences, information or data, provides me with a foundation for my beliefs, and I build on top of that theories.
I would say that I think it's totally respectable view to hold, and especially if you augment it away from the kind of empiricist kind of foundationalism that's prominent in the West. Because as I mentioned, the classical foundationalist view, and the one that's been influential in the West since the time of the Enlightenment, is that it's like the analogy of a house. Your house is resting on the foundation. And the foundation in your epistemology, in classical foundationalism, are these three types of beliefs. your self-evident beliefs, the one we talked about, your incorrigible beliefs, the ones you can't be wrong about, and your beliefs that are formed from your senses, your five senses. But I think if you augment that, and I suppose this is what you're saying, if you augment that and you admit a broader range of foundational beliefs, not just your five senses, but also any innate faculties you have to access the spiritual, that should be given equal merit, and therefore you can, you admit within your foundationalist picture a broader range of basic beliefs from which you can build up all your other, you can infer to all the other beliefs that you have. And I think that's quite a respectable system to hold.
Yeah, cool. It's really helpful how you're more involved in the philosophical literature, because I've got these ideas, but I'm not quite sure how they fit on the map. Because I did that podcast a few weeks ago with Gabriel, and he was misunderstanding me, and when I said foundationalism, and thinking I was leaving out concepts or spiritual experiences and so on. And yeah, I clarified that to him. Bhakti Vigyan Goswami is the name of the sannyasi who I quoted about the language differences between English and Russian. Perhaps we should bring it back and talk about religious experience a bit more. So the first thing I would like to say is that the kind of skepticism that says spiritual experiences can never be evidence for a spiritual world, I think is irrational, because what's the criteria by which they admit material experiences as evidence for material world while rejecting spiritual experiences? You could make it rational and say, while the spiritual experiences that people are reporting are not the same as the kinds of experiences that we have of this material world. People report a fuzzy feeling in their heart when they're in church, or a series of coincidences. But I've got this table here in front of me. I can chemically break it down. I can bang on it. It has persistence over time. Everybody else can walk into this room and they'll all see the same table, but not everyone works into the church and has. So they could argue like that. But you could also have stories of people who have religious experiences where they go to the spiritual world and shake hands and bring back an object, or Nishingadev sits on their chest and they get a scratch mark, which is there in the morning.
Yeah. Well, let me say a few things about that. I really appreciate that you have a knack of really honing in on key issues in this area. Two things I would say. Number one, first of all, I agree with you. I think it's inconsistent to privilege, or I think it's not fair to privilege one kind of experience, the experience of the five senses, and somehow move from that to saying that the experience, spiritual experiences are somehow less legitimate. But I think there's good reasons to support that. So let's look at what the worry is that people have with religious experiences. Well, for one thing, the science is based on sense experiences, right? It's based on getting data from the five senses. But what makes it so respected in society nowadays? What makes it respected is that there is a system of corroboration, cross-checking, verifying or falsifying results. That's what makes something scientific. On a popular approach to understanding this topic. So honing in on those criteria, for something to be verifiable or falsifiable, for something to be corroborated by public scrutiny, so someone else could go and conduct the experiment. They could either verify your result or they could falsify your result. It's open to being falsified. If something can't be falsified, then that's a real problem for us, for a process that's meant to be epistemologically respectable. This is one of the criticisms that philosophers of science had against people like Freud, for example. He said they would say that Freud will give a theory about some sort of behavior that we want to explain, and when that behavior doesn't pan out according to his theory, he will be able to explain it away based on some other part of his theory. Maybe you had this other childhood experience that led to that behavior, and the worry there is that you could never falsify the theory, so you can never really tell when you have a false belief, and that's a worry. Now, I'm mentioning that because I'm trying to say why science is trusted nowadays, considered so trustworthy. It can be generally, you would think scientific claims can be verified or falsified, and you would think it would be corroborated in some way, replicated. The process, the experiment. When you transfer that system across and you look to see what's happening on the religious side, do they meet the same criteria? Because the whole point of this argument is to say that religious experiences are analogous to sense experiences that's already highly respected. We arrive at beliefs using sense experience. That's what science is all about. That's a respected process. We can trust the beliefs that we form in that way. And we want to say religious beliefs are the same kind of thing. It's analogous to sense experience case. We arrive at beliefs using our religious, whatever spiritual faculties we have. And therefore, we want to say that that's respectable as well. The worry that people are going to bring into the picture is it doesn't seem like religious, spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't seem like it actually mirrors what's happening on the sense experience side. For one thing, some people would challenge that you can't really verify someone's mystical experience because you don't really know how would you go and verify it. That's what they would say. Or you can't falsify it. Even the person who had the religious experience wouldn't be able to tell the difference between that and a really, high quality illusion. So it can't be verified or falsified, it seems. It can't be corroborated and tested. And therefore, it doesn't seem to carry the same confidence. We're less sure. Like, suppose someone comes and said, well, I have a religious experience of, a funny example I heard of a great pumpkin or something as God. God was a great pumpkin, and he gave this whole elaborate story. How would you verify it? How would you falsify it? And what if millions of people had that, a similar illusion? How could you tell? And that seemed to count against religious experiences as having evidential value, or as being of the same, and being relevantly analogous to the sense experience case in science. That's the worry. For my part, I think it's overblown. For one thing, and this is recognized even in the literature in the West, mystical traditions or mystical experiences, the whole point of them is to, as we talked about earlier, is to orient yourself, to adopt a process, a systematic, rigorous process that from which you meant to have these spiritual experiences. So it's, in a sense, it's almost, it's not deterministically predictable, but there is, it's predictable to some extent that you would get certain religious experiences. So in that sense, it can be verified. And in fact, that's what we do in our tradition. We undertake, meditative practices, and we enter the process of Krishna consciousness that replicates the methods adopted by great saints and teachers in the East for millennia. And if the process works, we're meant to be able to verify that through our own faculties. The equivalent, I think, in the East, you will call it pratyaksha. Krishna says even in the Bhagavad Gita, this is in the 9th chapter, this knowledge being the king of knowledge and so forth, it's experienced. You can experience it by your own experience. It's not just testimony from the scriptures, so it's not just logic. There's also experience, your own personal experience. He uses that word, I believe, in the 9th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. So I want to say that idea that religious data from religious experiences is not relevantly analogous to the sense data case, sense experience case. I think that's a little bit overblown, because mystical experiences aim to do just that. They aim to corroborate, they aim to verify or falsify religious claims based on experience. I think that's like a really important point. The other point I wanted to make, and I'll try to make this one very brief, sorry for rambling there, but the other point I wanted to make is one famous philosopher, Alston, he made the point that when you look at the sense experience case or the science case, what's happening there is that, and you pointed this out earlier, Arjuna, there's no way for you to justify the beliefs that you're forming in that system in a non-circular way. If you're relying on sense experience data, then for all you know, your sense experience, your sense faculties are not in working order. But you need to have your foundation somewhere, and you need to have enough beliefs in your foundation to infer all your other beliefs. So what I want to say is, he called it the doxastic practice. You have a doxastic practice, like in science, where you receive data from your senses. You have a system whereby you corroborate it with others. It's defeasible in that sense. You can test it. It's been reliable, in the past. So you kind of have reason to think that this practice you have of receiving beliefs or forming beliefs using this process is credible. And what he said was that there is also a doxastic process, we call it, on the religious side, for spiritual beliefs, for religious beliefs. You have a faculty that gives you data about spiritual reality, especially when you take it from a mystical perspective and you actually undertake a process to open up yourself to those kinds of experiences. You have a way of testing that from testimony. He used a Christian example. He said there's scriptures, there's saints in the tradition who can, you go to when you have a religious experience, and you talk about it and you discuss whether this is veridical or not. You have reasoning faculty. You have a whole system whereby the beliefs you're getting from your doxastic practice is, you can take it to be warranted. Unless you have reason to doubt its reliability, you're justified. And it remains a rational belief for you, unless you have good reason to think this doxastic practice of yours is unreliable. So, and I think that's a fair point. In the religious side, just as in the sense, science side, we have faculties that give us data about some kind of reality, whether it's material reality or spiritual reality, and we have a system in place to weed out false beliefs from the true ones, and check that they're coherent, check that they're consistent with all the other beliefs that we hold in that system. And that should give us confidence that the process that we're employing to arrive at our religious beliefs is a sensible one. So just to draw it to a close, all I wanted to say was, you raised a really good point about religious experience and the extent to which we can take that as having evidential value. I think we can. One, there's good reason to think it's analogous to sense experience. It's different, but it's relevantly analogous in the epistemically relevant sense. And there's a whole system behind it that helps you to protect against falsity. I can't, like you said in relation to Oppie earlier, it's hard to see how that could be anything but rational.
Those are some good points. I like the way you explained similarities between scientific epistemology and spiritual epistemology when it's done well. I also think it's not just about mystical experiences, but it could also be about coming to understand the truth of religious concepts either through clearing your consciousness to the point where you can see the truth of them, or from hearing them and finally understanding the logic as it's explained to you. And how we can explain that clarity of consciousness it takes a bit of psychologizing, but I don't think you can do epistemology without a little bit of psychologizing. At least you'd be missing a major factor if you didn't have it there. And not that we should psychologize particular individuals and say, oh, he just believes this because of this. But in terms of understanding principles of how humans operate, this is certainly a factor, which is, if you don't want to believe something is true, you can be incapable of seeing even good evidence for it. And we see this all the time. The wife's in an unstable relationship, an unhealthy relationship, but she doesn't want to believe it. She was taught that you get married and you stay with the one person, and she was taught that this is a good person and they're going to look after you. And despite all the warning signs and all the suffering, she refuses to believe that the relationship is unhealthy. And that's just one example. Another one is, being cheated in business. You could have a business partner who's cheating you, ignore all of the warning signs, and when the whole thing finally comes crashing down, you're like, how did I not see that? There were so many warning signs that I was being cheated. But at the time, you fail to see them simply because you don't want to believe them they're true. So in basically, in the Greek traditions and definitely in the Indian traditions, there's this idea of your state of consciousness being a determining factor in your access to knowledge. Knowledge is state dependent. This is why when you want to get serious about spiritual life, you become vegetarian, you take on a meditation practice, and you live a moral lifestyle.
Just as you would have to do if you want to understand quantum mechanics, you have to undertake, you have to do the degree, you have to undertake the training, you have to do the experiments. You have, as you said earlier, you have to qualify yourself to get that knowledge.
Yeah, well, there's this really strong understanding in Indian traditions of the idea that the Brahmana, the person in society whose job it is to make sense and distribute that sense, to come to to understand knowledge and share knowledge, that person needs to be independent. So there's that quote, it's amazing what someone will fail to understand if their paycheck depends on him not understanding it. Something to that effect. So this is a well understood concept in Indian traditions, that the Brahmin can't be dependent in any way like that. They have to be fully independent to express whatever they think to be true. And this also applies to our own meaning making. So as having a false ego, I'm an atheist and I've come up with all these beliefs, or you can say the same things and psychologize about theists. I'm just saying this is a factor that although I wouldn't use it in a particular circumstance to say, oh, this atheist just believes in atheism because they want to enjoy sense pleasures and they don't want to believe that God's here looking after them. I don't think that's an honest move to make. But I do think we have to say this as one factor, because moving on to the next point I want to make, we have to look at the data of, well, first of all, I'll say this, which is, if I as an individual have a very profound sense experience, or even a synchronicity like that, like I gave that Bayesian reasoning example earlier, that guy who robbed the bank, knowing that people who rob banks in that particular city generally don't even survive because the cops come with their guns. So the fact that the lady, I think, fainted and he got out of there without the police even being called, he may be justified in believing that was arranged by God. Even if when you analyze all the data, you say, well, 1 million people have done this and only one of them had the lady faint. And of course, the lady's going to faint one time, and out of 1 million times, there's going to be a lady who faints and the guy's going to have said something to God beforehand. So that the fact that you could do the Bayesian analysis and say, it doesn't give us evidence for God, doesn't take away his reason for believing, because he's only aware of his one sample of that.
Right.
So, but just like like another way of putting that is, so the point I'm coming to is the worry would be, well, sure, 50% of the people who follow this practice, or even 90% of the people who follow this practice, become believing Hare Krishnas. But what about the other 10%? If it was a reliable process, it should work for everyone. But I don't think that objection works, at least not on an individual basis. It may be like, well, if I look at this externally and say, oh, it's only working 50% of the time, that's not reliable. But for those people, those 50%, it is evidence for them. In the same way, if I go to a store and there's a particular item and I buy it there, and 50% of the people who go to that door are able to buy the same item, and we all say, yeah, you go to the store, you can buy this thing, look, here it is. It's not a perfect analogy, but the other 50% of people who go to the store and don't find that item provide zero evidence that store doesn't sell that item. All it provides evidence for is that they were out of stock, or they just didn't know where to look to find that item. So coming back to the religious experience example, from time to time, somebody takes up Krishna consciousness, practices it for a while, and says, it didn't work. I'm still an atheist, or I'm going back to being an atheist. And what we will want to say, what the Hare Krishna apologist is going to say in those circumstances is there's subtle variables that we're not aware of that mean that person either wasn't doing the process right, had some baggage that they carried with them and didn't put down, and that's why the process didn't work for them. The process still works. There's just some subtle variable that prevented it from working. And that sounds like circular reasoning. Oh, you've just got an answer for everything. And any kind of data you have, you've got an answer for. The trouble is, the same argument will be given. This is an argument Sataputra Prabhu gave Richard Thompson, that the same argument will be given in scientific circles. So the example he gave is measuring gravity. So measuring, I think maybe you say measuring the constant of gravity, there's subtle variables that can mean it don't work. So it has to be done in a place where, like, vibrations from cars driving past will throw it off, so that your measurements are inaccurate or fail. So they do it at night, and they do it in a building that's sheltered from the vibrations from outside. And if an undergraduate student attempts to study using all the right equipment and fails in their attempt to measure gravity, they will simply be told, you didn't do it right. Other people did it. It worked for them. You've done something wrong. So if that's a fitting answer, that we could say, oh, you get an answer for everyone. I do it and it doesn't work. And you just say, I did something wrong. But because it's subtle variables, just like slight vibrations throw off the equipment, you can't point in this scientific example to the thing which the student did wrong. All you can say is, it worked for other people, so you must have done something wrong. Some other variables come in. So it's the exact same argument given, really. But the scientific one's accepted, and the Hare Krishna one is, oh yeah, the Hare Krishna apologist has an answer for everything.
Yeah. I think I agree with you, but in today's world, the way science is viewed and the kind of successes that science has had in the past, people could be forgiven for thinking or seeing some sort of disanalogy between the two cases. I think what it boils down to is a sort of the object that the two processes are studying. In science, you're studying the material world, and the material world is deterministic. What that means is you have absolute predictive capability with the material world. Or as one teacher of mine, who I think you had you had here on your podcast, Shivananda Das Goswami, he says it very forcefully. I like the way he describes it. If in material science you can control the object of your study to a certain extent, you can control the results you get from it. Whereas in a spiritual investigation, that's not that's not the characteristic of the thing that you're researching. If there is such a thing as a God, he is not subject to our experimental control. So even if we do everything right, just as in the case, like if you want to have a process of falling in love, getting someone to love you and getting a deep relationship with a girl or a boy. You may do all the right things, and that person may still, there is an element of this experiment that is down to the other person. And in the same way, if there is such a thing as a God or some divine reality, whatever tradition, in different traditions have different conceptions of what ultimate reality is like. But that thing may not be within your control. So in the scientific domain, there is a certain confidence that we get from predicting outcomes and then seeing those outcomes realized by our process. So when someone says in the scientific domain, you probably didn't do it right, what's lurking behind there, not lurking, I shouldn't use that word, but what's underlying that whole exchange is the idea that in principle, I can get exactly the same result as you did if I reproduce your process exactly. That's what the science should show. We're predicting a certain outcome, and we should exactly get that outcome if we do the experiment in the right way. And there's no in principle bar to me doing that. It's just a question of whether I take the trouble to do it right. That's the way that whole system works. Whereas on the spiritual side, it's not deterministic. There is a reliable process if you want to get into a communion with God or some spiritual reality. You want some sort of realization, as other traditions would say, about the ultimate reality. There is a reliable process that might bring you closer to that, but it may not be quite as guaranteed as the materialistic scientific process. That doesn't make it any less rational or any less scientific, I don't think. It's just that the object of your study is different, and you have to approach your experiment with that in mind. So if someone goes through the process, tries to undertake the process of Krishna consciousness and doesn't quite get the result that they predicted, for one thing, in principle, that doesn't make the process false, because it's not a materialistic science that you're engaging in. You're engaging in a spiritual science, and it's not a spiritual science is not deterministic in the same way. And therefore, there is more scope for what you said, Arjuna, of these other variables affecting the outcome, just as trying to undergoing a process to win the heart of someone that you want to win the heart of. It may not be deterministic. There may be subtle things that come in there that influence the outcome that you might not be able to predict, and so forth. But that doesn't make it any less respectable. It's what we then need to do is consider, be a bit more patient or flexible, and take consultation from experts, as you would do in science. Take consultation from those who have successfully completed the experiment, get suggestions, take into your confidence those you trust who have your best interests to heart, to give you guidance and encouragement so you can rationally proceed with the experiment, and not because you're doing you're invoking all these other factors. It doesn't mean that the process becomes irrational. It's still rational. You're not blindly accepting something, but you are dealing with the object of your study in the appropriate way. Now, this idea of it's very easy nowadays for people to, and this is just because of the dominance of materialistic science, but it's very easy for people to move from, they hold the scientific worldview as foundation, and then they try to situate religious experiences within that. I give you a really famous challenge that people might have. For example, they might say that this is something that's allegedly, there's some kind of evidence for this in studies and so forth, that religious experiences are explained by certain neurological goings on. there seems to be correlations between certain religious experiences and, bouts of seizure in some patients, or certain pathologies, for example. There's some people might think, because there might be a correlation between neurological events in your brain and certain religious experiences, that the one causes the other. And if people like Freud held this kind of view, they kind of reduced religious experiences to something else in the material domain that can be controlled, that can be understood and analyzed within our control, and to think, well, we don't need to postulate this other domain, this other reality. If our spiritual experiences are being caused by neurological events, then that is in itself the explanation. We don't need to postulate that there's a God out there that's causing my experiences. There isn't an external thing that's impinging on some senses of mine that's giving me that religious experiences. No, it's just my brain doing something that's giving me that experiences. And that might sound really sensible to people in general because of the success that material science has had. And this is why it's important, as you said, Arjuna, to have a good understanding of how reasoning works, critical thinking, and to employ other sources in your epistemology, other sources of knowledge, so that you can corroborate and assess the rationality of these claims. Like that claim about neurology might sound rational to a scientist or someone who's an atheist, but actually is completely irrational. Because, in fact, to make it seem like a neurological process is causing a religious experience, you first have to realize that every experience, not just religious experiences, are correlated with a neurological event in the brain. So if all it takes to discredit a religious experience is to say, well, there's a religious thing, there's a neurological thing happening in the brain, then that discredits your normal experiences as well. It discredits everything. So I think we have to take the time to be spiritual scientists, and we should responsibly practice and follow our process of Krishna consciousness. Take precautionary measures to avoid being cultish in our practice and just accepting things blindly or rejecting things blindly. Consult with experts, take a scientific approach, bearing in mind that the object of your study is not under your deterministic control, but you are in a process, as you would with another person or friend or colleague, where you can probably get access to them through a tried and tested method. And it's our choice whether we want to take that seriously and undertake the experiment rationally to see what the outcome would be. And just to wrap that up, the evidence in our tradition suggests, and many of our experiences, many of us have had spiritual experiences, and I think that evidence suggests that there is there's good reason to believe that we are coming into contact with the truth, and that our methods of pursuing that knowledge are rational, and there's nothing to be ashamed about it. It's not something inconsistent with with science. It's not it's something that's to be. I think it's an, what's the word? I once heard, I mentioned Shivananda Goswami earlier. He once said something. He doesn't just he wants this process, when people hear about it who are not already committed to the view, he wants them to think, these people are practicing something respectable. He wants to be emulated for it. It's not something fanciful. It's not something biased in a sense. It's not something like irrational and disreputable in some way. It's something that people practice in a serious, you might even say, obviously there's a strong subjective component to the practice because it's about our own internal states, developing our consciousness, as you say, but there is a very strong objective element to the process, like with science, where we have objective means of trying to protect ourselves against falsity. And that's very important for an epistemic process. And I think Krishna consciousness aspires, at least the principle the practice as I understand it, is an epistemically respectable practice. And it's up to us to try to imbibe that in our practice and take full advantage of it.
Right. On the experience as being produced by the brain point, my question for the skeptic who says, oh, we can simulate, there's something where they say they can use magnetic stimulation of the cranium to generate God experiences. My question for them would be, if you could stimulate somebody to have an experience of eating cake, would you then go on to believe that cake does not exist?
That's a great way to put it.
The second one would be, in response to that, would be take someone who's spiritually considered to be, take a collection of people who are considered to be spiritually elevated, give them that experience that's produced in the lab, and they may come out of it and say, that's a different experience. That was produced by that computer. I've experienced God. God is something else. Your machine did not produce an experience of God, because someone who hasn't experienced God may be easily fooled by a machine in a lab. But if you have experienced God, you're going to know the difference. You're going to have something to compare it to. There was another.
Just quickly on that.
Yeah, sure.
Just quickly on that point. Just to add, and it's also interesting. Not interesting, but it's also important to do what you said earlier and to recognize it's not just all about religious experiences, because the whole internalist externalist debate, foundationalism versus externalism or whatever, there's different approaches to defending the rationality of religious beliefs. One of them is to do a lot of what we were discussing so far, which is to say things like religious beliefs can be properly basic. They can themselves be basic beliefs, just like in with sense experience, and from that we can infer many other things. We can use that in our repertoire in making knowledge claims. But there are also other things to bear in mind. For example, as you said, there's many great arguments, logical arguments for that lend credence to the idea that there might be a God, or the idea that I might be more than just a physical being. There's reasoning and logic also play an important role in supporting religious experiences and informing the way we choose to direct our lives. Sorry, I interrupted. You go ahead.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about experience. I mean, someone could have some kind of experience which they think proves aliens or some spirituality or something, and they could talk about that with people who are better informed than them, and they could say, "Oh no, these crop circles or what that funny wind you experienced or whatever it is, that's actually produced by this. It was a weather balloon, or it's just a storm last night, or whatever it is." And if the person may be convinced, like, "Oh yeah, that totally explains my experience," but there is a category of experiences people have where, like, there was a researcher who Jordan Peterson quotes, I can't remember his name, who was doing DMT experiments, and he stopped doing the research not because it wasn't fruitful, but because he was a hard physicalist and it was doing his head in, because people would have this DMT experience and come back and say, "I went somewhere, I saw something, it was real," and he'd be like, "No, you were on drugs, it was your brain," and they'd be like, "No, it was real. I went there. I saw that." And he wasn't able to convince these people, no matter what he told them. So that kind of thing, I would be inclined to think is evidence that they were experiencing something else. Because if it's the case that it's all produced by the brain and so on, then you should be able to enlighten these people to that fact. And I imagine there's a certain quality of supernatural or spiritual experiences which, no matter what your prior beliefs were going into it, you're going to be like, okay, no, this means aliens exist. This means whatever your experience of it was. And no one's going to be able to tell you otherwise because of the resolution of your experience. But I wanted to come back to a point you made earlier. Maybe I should have jumped in sooner, but you were talking about how the scientific experiment, I gave the measuring gravity example. It's different from the spiritual science, from the...
Well, some people might argue that, I was saying.
Well, you were making a point that it is different because God is not something we can control. So with the scientific experiment, it's like you pull all the right levers in the right order, you're going to get the same result every single time, all else being equal. Right. But when you're dealing with another person, like, there's pickup artists, and they are extremely good at picking up women, right? And they get it down to a science, but it doesn't mean it works on every single woman because there's variables. Maybe I shouldn't have given that example. It's a bit graphic. But so, similarly with God, it's not just like a procedure you follow that other people follow this procedure. So if I follow this procedure, God's going to reciprocate with me in the same way. There's some truth to that, but I would say there's also an important way that it's not true, which is that, of course, God's not some mechanistic thing. It's not about pulling levers. It's about subtle intentions and motivations. So if you go to God with all the right effort, determination, and sincerity, you'll get the same result as everyone else that went with the same determination and sincerity. And it's just that the variables are subtle things like intentionality, determination, rather than mechanistic things. But still, God is impartial. He will react the same way to the same intentions and sincerity, no matter who it's from.
Yeah, this is part of what these Christian philosophers call the wider doxastic practice that you embed these kinds of systems in. So we can see that the point that you're making is absolutely valid, because in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna talks about reciprocating with us according to how we approach him, right? So it may not, in the scientific case, the object of inquiry doesn't really have any choice in the matter. And in the spiritual science case, if we're trying to investigate Krishna, then Krishna does have a choice in the matter. But at the same time, Krishna is saying, he's saying, I will reciprocate with you in such and such a fashion. So that's part of, the background doxastic practice, as these Christian philosophers called it. There's a scriptural testimony that we're bringing into the picture. There's other practitioners and their the evidence from their experiences that we're bringing into the picture, and all of those things have to hang together consistently. So I think you're right. I really like what you said. It's true that there is something of a disanalogy between science and spirituality, material science and spirituality, in terms of which, how deterministic it can be. But you could still have a spiritual science even if the object of inquiry isn't fully under deterministic control, especially when you have all these other factors that inform the practice and help guide you towards the outcome, like Krishna's statements in the Gita, for example. So it's a great point you made.
Yeah, I thought we could finish by playing a video from the Babylon Bee where they make fun of a kind of skepticism, because something you said made me think about it. I'll just see if the sound's working.
Will I be able to see it as well?
Oh, hang on. If you let's just check if the sound's working. Oh, hang on, I've muted it. Sorry, one sec.
Well, if I don't get the chance after the video, I just wanted to thank you again, Arjuna, for spending over 2 hours with me now, talking about epistemology. I was thinking it was going to be an hour,
Oh,
but actually, I wouldn't trade it. It was great spending time with you.
There's one last point I wanted to make actually before we get to something comedic related to the epistemology, which is Dr. Howard Resnick, aka Sridhar Goswami, makes this point really well, that if we have a diversity of religious traditions from a diversity of cultures and geographical locations, which all generate similar spiritual experiences and similar kinds of wisdom, then that makes it seem empirical. So, like we're talking about, people doing similar things should get similar results. So all over the world, people can light fires in the same way. People can treat various medical conditions in the same way because the laws of physics are consistent. So similarly, if there is a spiritual reality, it should apply consistently, regardless of what tradition you're in and so on, if you're doing similar things. So if we look at that, we find there's vegetarian spiritual traditions all over the world. There's ideas about compassion and nonviolence and dedicating your life to God. And I imagine if you got all these people that were considered great saints in these traditions all together in a room, they would agree on a lot of things. And you do find people coming to religious disagreements based on their mystical experiences. But then we need to ask the question of what is actually directly informed by that experience, and what is theories based on that experience, which are heavily influenced by the culture the person's in.
Yeah, so that's quite a what you raised there is a massive debate in the literature. It's interesting. It's sometimes swung the other way as well. Like there's the essentialist view that's all these religious experience, diverse traditions, and people from different parts of history and different cultures. They want to say that there is a core essence to a spiritual or mystical experience that is common across all these different eras and traditions. There is also the opposing view that actually these religious experiences present opposing pictures, give different reports about what is being experienced. And they give the analogy, like if you ask for eyewitness reports about some in a similar situation, but you ask for eyewitness reports and you get someone saying, well, it was this person who committed the murder, and another person says, well, no, it was this thing that committed the murder. And if you get conflicting statements about the object, that tends to discredit the evidential value of those reports. So some people say that different traditions give wildly divergent views about the object of spiritual experience. Some people say it's personal in nature. Some people have a mystical experience of something that's completely non-personal in nature. In some other traditions, like Buddhist traditions, their mystics have experience of nothingness as ultimate reality. Other people have completely different kinds of mystical experiences. So there is a criticism that's levied that says that even though there's a sense where they're all experiencing something, a mystical experience that's non-physical, there seems to be irreconcilable differences in some of these reports about what it is that's actually being experienced. Is it a personal reality, or is it not, and so forth. What I like the point you made, that even though there are these divergent traditions and so forth, I'll say it this way. I read a response to this in the literature by a Christian philosopher, I think it was, and he said, this is only to be expected from the inexhaustible nature of God. And this is something that's actually, it made me think about the Srimad Bhagavatam, in the first canto, where it defines the ultimate, the absolute truth as, in these three aspects of Brahman, Paramatman, Bhagavan, with a personal aspect, sort of being a core and the highest aspect of the absolute. So the idea is, if God is inexhaustible in this way, then he is able to to engage with the mystic according to, as you said, the conceptual framework that they're coming at him from, or according to the culture that they're in, or according to their own personal preferences. Even you talked about intentions earlier. If someone wants to experience the divine in a non-personal way, there is the divine is inexhaustible in such a way that it has that aspect to it. There is Brahman, the non-personal aspect of the absolute truth. Of course, in our tradition, we privilege Bhagavan, the personal aspect. And according to the Bhagavad Gita, that is the ultimate. God is ultimately personal in nature, and the non-personal aspects rest on him. But the point is, we were an inclusivist religion. I actually heard you talk about this once. We're not exclusivist, we're not pluralist, we're inclusivist in the sense that we can accommodate the mystical experiences in our tradition's tenets. We can accommodate a variety of mystical experiences. They need not be in conflict. And I think that, that response does blunt the force of this critique that people's mystical experiences seem to report conflicting concepts of reality, and therefore we should dispense with them as being, as counting as good evidence. Actually, according to our tradition, that's exactly what you would expect. You would expect God to respond according to the, as you said, the conceptual framework or the culture or the intentions of the mystic or the devotee or whatever.
Yeah,
I interrupted there, I think. Sorry, you were saying something. I think I might have interrupted you.
Oh no, that I'd made my point. I was gonna then I'll move on to the comedic video from the Babylon Bee, which relates to some points you were making earlier. But yeah, that's a really nice point about how if God is full of all qualities, diverse, then we would expect to see that people from different traditions have different experiences of God, because God's reciprocating with them according to what they're going to react to nicely, what their expectations are, and a way to build the relationship. Another point that's a big difference, an assumption that a lot of people have about God, especially skeptics, think, if God exists, he should be wanting us to have accurate propositional knowledge of him all the time. And if, so this is evidence God doesn't exist, because if God does exist, he'd be here giving us everyone accurate knowledge of him, and he's not doing that, so he must not exist. But it could be that God's top priority isn't having you believe everything which is true and only believing true things. It could be that God's top priority is having you go on a journey of consciousness which instills in you certain qualities and removes from you certain qualities, with the ultimate goal of elevating you to a state of pure love, of pure love of God, of becoming a perfect moral being, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. One wonderful point. And in fact, I would even go further. God, it could be, and it seems likely, not even that it could be, it seems very plausible that if there is a God and he's absolutely good and he has your best interest at heart and so forth, in our tradition, we say he's, one of his opulences is that he's, complete renunciation. So it could be that he may want you to have access to truths and stuff, but it doesn't mean that he insists that you should have all, you should live by and revolve your life around truths pertaining to his ultimate nature. Now, he may want you to have truths about the world, truths about yourself, truths about, other aspects of reality. But if you have a kind of an inclination in your heart that you don't want to revolve yourself at this stage in your existence around a divine relationship with God, then he reciprocates. He's not going to punish you for that. He might actually facilitate that for you. You could live in our tradition, you can live a perfectly good life, completely, ignoring God. You can live in the mode of goodness, and he would facilitate that for you. So I think you're making a really important point, and it's not, I think you downplayed it. It's not even that it could be like that. I think that's exactly what you would expect from the God as described in our scriptures.
Yeah, cool. All right, so we should wrap it up soon, but I wanted to play this video because it's relevant and funny. So this is just a satirical take on deconversion stories using all the worst arguments and all the worst epistemology. So not serious not a serious. There are serious skeptics, and this is not addressing them.
I was raised in the church. I participated in youth group, went on multiple mission trips. I guess you could have called me an evangelical. But now, I'm an ex-evangelical, and my unique deconversion story that is exactly the same as every other deconversion story must be told. I had a DTR with Jesus at a very young age. I loved him. I probably would have called him my boyfriend if I hadn't kissed dating goodbye. But then a college professor asked me how a loving God could oppose homosexuality, and it occurred to me that I had never once thought about what I believed, and I abandoned my faith like that. Since then, I have learned all kinds of arguments against Christianity. Did you know that there are other religions? Explain that, Christians. Or did you know that some people have had bad experiences with people at church? I'd love to hear the apologetics to explain that one. And I don't want to get too heady. I'm not sure how intellectual you want to get, but have you heard of science? If God was real, then why science? Science. Checkmate. I just can't believe not a single other evangelical has ever thought about this, except for all those other ex-evangelicals who abandoned the faith in the exact same way. When I was a Christian, I had so much self-doubt. I judged other people all the time, and I felt overwhelmingly repressed, all in the name of Christ. Now that I no longer believe in that stuff, I have so much self-doubt. I judge other people all the time, and I'm repressed like never before, all in the name of myself. Christians don't realize how dogmatic and controlling their religion is. Like now, on Sundays, I can do yoga or complain about the no dogs rule at the farmer's market instead of going to the church or feeding the homeless. Ugh. Instead of reading the Bible, I can read quotes on Instagram. And when someone is telling me their prayer request, I can freely wait until it's my turn to talk and then make their problem about me. The idea of evangelism is so offensive. To try to convince people that your beliefs are right while their beliefs are wrong is reprehensible. And I've now made it my life's mission to convince people of that. I can't believe I used to stand on the sidewalk asking people if they wanted to hear the 4 spiritual laws. How arrogant do you have to be to do that? Sorry, Christians, you don't get to tell people their beliefs are wrong. I do.
Yeah, anyway.
that was great, Arjuna.
Yeah, it's pretty good, eh? There was something in there, but other religions exist. Explain that one, Christians.
And if there's a God, why science?
Yeah, obviously.
It was great spending time with you, Arjuna.
Yeah, cool. I really appreciate that. I got a lot out of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.